So next up, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bill Braham. He is a professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, where he previously served as chair. He is currently the director of the Master of Environmental Building Design and of the Center for Environmental Building and Design, or Plus Design. Either one. All right. He has worked on energy and architecture for over 30 years as a designer, consultant, researcher, and author of numerous articles and books. He recently published Architecture and Systems Ecology, Thermodynamic Principles for Environmental Building Design in 3 parts. He also co-edited Energy Accounts, Architectural Representations of Energy, Climate, and the Future, and Architecture and Energy, Performance and Style, and Rethinking Technology, a reader in architectural theory. He is currently working on a project called The City Always Writes in the Plural, Narratives of Urban Self-Organization. Please help me welcome Dr. Bill Braham.
So, is this on? Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me if I shout?
We're going to turn you up.
Okay. Well, while they're turning me up, I can say, I've been sitting here rewriting my lecture. I'm now going to answer every one of David Orr's points. The slides will do, no. One, we do have a conversation afterwards, and I look forward to that conversation. But first, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this. This is a fantastic project, both close to my heart, but I also have to start by saying I'm the complete outlier here. This one has actual ecologists in it, people who have studied and thought about ecology, and I really have come to this over these last 30 years. This actually is me well over 30 years ago. And I'll say, I'm an architect. This tale I'm going to tell today is very much the education of a young, well, not so young architect now. And I started with this picture not just to prove that I had hair, but to make the very important point, and I don't know how many people come at it from this direction, but in architecture, ecology enters in as a mandate about efficiency or renunciation. Codes are written almost with that entirely in mind. And so part of the story I want to tell is, or part of the message that I want to convey is, to put efficiency in its place. Hugely important, it's a very powerful tool, but it cannot be the point of design. It cannot be the goal that we're looking for. So you'll see as I go along here, I find diagrams helpful. I might even be obsessed with diagrams. I find them clarifying, and because I teach architects, it's hugely helpful to do these things in a visual way. But it also, for me, charts kind of a history. This diagram on the left, drawn by an architect, Frederick Kiesler, in the 1930s. I discovered this 20 years ago, and literally it sort of shook the foundations of the way I was thinking about things. I had been focused on energy. I've been focused on making solar buildings, all good things still. But Kiesler did this diagram in the 1930s. He was a co-traveler in those days with Buckminster Fuller. They were both thinking hard about how tools evolved. Buildings was one focus, but technologies generally, how did they evolve? And Kiesler did this diagram to make a very simple point, which was there are things that condition and drive the evolutions of technologies. We all live this when we wake up in the morning and find that our cell phone has updated itself and left something out that we thought was actually kind of useful. But technologies have their own trajectory. Human, social, cultural, we'll say political systems have their own trajectory, and natural systems have their own evolutionary trajectory. He called these 3 co-evolving environments. They obviously heavily influence each other. I did an updated version under the influence of all the things I'm about to talk to you about to make the rather simple point that both of those 2 forms of human and technological evolution are totally embedded in and depend on the natural systems from which they emerged. Often we're in tension, and it's important to understand how those things bump up against each other. But my education, you'll say, began by discovering this concept of self-organization, a very fashionable concept in architecture 20 and 30 years ago, commonplace in engineering, commonplace in ecology, and the example that sticks with me because it's the one I've lived, which is in I grew up in Pittsburgh and live now in Philadelphia, but in this ecosystem, if you stop mowing your lawn, even for a couple of years, or if you see a farmer's field that's no longer being tended, or even a vacant lot in the city, this is what it'll turn into. This is self-organization at its most powerful, and also it's sort of most puzzling, because every time it emerges, it's a different forest, different species, different creatures, slightly different mixes, but at the end of the day, it's basically the same thing. It is this remarkable, unbelievable process, which I came to late in life and also understand sits at the heart of what ecologists have been theorizing about for well over 100 years. But pulling it into our environment, you can say exactly the same thing about human constructions. In fact, I would argue that cities are the engine and the product of human civilization. They're what we do, whether we think we're doing it or not, and even when we're living out here in what seems like the country, we are a very important piece of the urban self-organization that we've constructed in the landscape of the United States. So the puzzle for me has been to think ecologically about this seemingly unecological thing, or this seemingly unnatural thing. But to recognize that the same rules in broad terms that guide the emergence of ecosystems, natural ecosystems like saltwater estuaries, also drives the emergence of things like cities. Now, I haven't used the word design yet. We design cities. We have professions called urban design and city planners. And for at least 100 years, we've been under the influence of really important and powerful ideas. This is Ebenezer Howard's Garden City proposals from the turn of the 20th century. We have been trying to design cities since cities first emerged, but cities are always wriggling out from under the control. You can think of urban designers as trying to keep up with or channel cities. So I put it in this way because I think it's important to recognize that one of the lessons that ecology brings to designers is that we're not in control. We are intervening. We're more like gardeners than we are like God. And it's important to be a little bit humble there. So while we've been designing that, this is what we have produced. This is the East Coast megalopolis. This is actually as a carbon footprint per household. So we have been constructing this massive enterprise. At the same time, we have been hopefully modifying it in many different levels to try and produce this. Now, everybody from economists to urban designers to geographers to architects to, I'm sure, ecologists have theorized about why cities turn out the way they are. I'm just showing you a couple of charts from one fascinating article by actually a bunch of scientists, a biologist, I think, some systems theorists, and so on, trolling the data and demonstrating that cities basically succeed because the bigger they get, the more powerful they are. And they meant that in lots and lots of different terms. You see two things here, both of which won't be news to almost anybody, which is the bigger the city, the higher the wages. The bigger the cities, the more forms of innovation. And we're not just talking about quantity, but we're talking per unit. So cities actually succeed in lots of positive ways the bigger they get. We also know that they succeed in lots of negative ways. Crime is bigger, pollution is bigger, traffic is worse, all of those things. So stuff happens when cities get bigger, and economists in particular have been arguing about why cities work. I'll just say it comes down to what seems like a dilemma, an unsolvable dilemma. Do cities succeed because they're more efficient, right? It's better to be closer and to cut distances and to make it easier to hire people, or do they succeed because they're concentrating wealth and they're concentrating power, and power is able to gather more power? It turns out the answer is both, and I'll sort of dwell on that theme for the rest of this talk, but basically efficiency is a way to create wealth, and wealth allows you the luxury of making some things more efficient. So that'll bring me to my first systems principle, and also to disclose that my pursuit of that question, my education really took a jump up when I rediscovered the work of Howard Odum, one of the two great brother ecologists of the 20th century in the US, invented what's now called systems ecology. Really almost impossible to list the things that he accomplished. And I've extracted from his work over his 50 or 60 years, 3 principles to talk about today. We were asked, by the way, I love the charge for this event, which was to convey some principles. So I'm cheating a little bit and pulling 3 principles from somebody else's work, but talking about the way in which they made sense to me. So first principle is systems self-organize to maximize their power. He actually qualified that and said empower. I'll explain what that means in a second. But the really shocking thing to me, as somebody who has a little bit of an engineering training in my background, was that he argued that that happens at intermediate efficiencies. Now, maybe this doesn't bother most of you, but anybody trained as an engineer knows that you should be designing everything for maximum efficiency. We all want to buy the car with the most, well, maybe not everybody, but people want to buy cars with the maximum miles per gallon and so forth. It seems that that's the ethic we should be following. And yet, everybody, everywhere, in almost every decision we make in daily life, trades power for efficiency. It would be a lot more efficient to drive to the grocery store more slowly, right? You save a lot of gas, but we all choose that speed that works for the pattern of life. And we're making some trade-off, actually probably a very real trade-off between the value of my time later in the day when I'm working and making money, so it's worth it to drive faster to the grocery store because I don't want to, who wants to save gas here when I can make money there? So we make all of those decisions, and those things collectively lead to this maximization of power. So I'm dwelling on this seemingly abstract, goal of systems because I think if we're going to enter, we can't enter into ecological design naively. If we're going to try to understand how to make these things better, we have to understand why they are the way they are, and not be, as many of the conferences I go to, we get to the end and we've all agreed that something's terrible, and then we say, that's great, now it should change. So why is it the way it is? How did it get that way? And how can we enter in to make it change? So second principle begins with Lindemann's work from the 1940s. This, I understand, again, I'm not an ecologist, was groundbreaking in ecology, and he was the first person to follow in a quantitative way, the food chain within an ecosystem. And he was looking at an aquatic ecosystem and arguing that the food chain itself describes the structure of the system. So by following the food, literally following the energy exchanges, you can understand how that system has self-organized. The thing I love about this diagram, as I said, I love diagrams, this circular version of a food chain, which starts at the top with sunlight coming in, goes through, I won't read you all the words here, but up to the predators. But at the center of it is ooze. At the center of it is the stuff that processes all the wastes and remakes it available for plankton eaters and carnivores and so forth to actually survive. So, but the point I'm trying to make is, when I said intermediate efficiency, that means you're doing things and creating unnecessary waste. You could have done that thing more efficiently. So, but the key to the second principle is waste then becomes food for some other part of the system. Right? That systems like this work, in a sense, they don't do this for any reason other than their own immediate purposes, but the wasteful activity of every part of this food chain makes possible the whole system. So by working at intermediate efficiency, it becomes possible to build this whole food chain, and so paying attention to waste becomes one of the first things we do when we're trying to think about designing a system, whether we're talking about something small and product-like or something big and city-like. I will not try to explain Howard Odom's accounting system of what he calls emergy, which can stand for either embodied energy or energy memory. But this is a diagram of the entire biosphere, and if you just follow this red line to think about either the cost or the value of human assets, the system that he developed was one of counting all the upstream costs and all the downstream costs for any product, service, activity, whatever you're doing. So it's a massively complex accounting system, which has been turned into a few simple rules. This system then led him, really following Lindemann's work, to use. Sorry, let me stop here for a second. To use that tracking of who eats what, who feeds whom, what energies come from what places and go to what places, where do the wastes go, to use that whole set of processes to understand complex ecosystems, and not just natural ecosystems, but human ones. And in fact, this is a diagram specifically asking the question about the costs and values of all the assets that we have built up as human civilization. So his second principle was that systems self-organize into hierarchies of energy exchange and feedback. They do this to maximize power. Mature ecosystems, climax forests, saltwater estuaries, and so forth, they reach a tremendous level of complexity, but like a human city, what they then do is support much larger populations. So they're maximizing their power in a number of different ways. Now, there's been quite a bit of work, actually there's been a huge amount of work trying to understand cities. So I'm only talking about that slice that follows this particular theme that I'm talking about, which is tracking resource flows and resource exchanges to try and understand them. Really a fantastic, like a 20-year body of work by Shuli Huang based in Taipei. He did some early work with Odom and then has spent the rest of his career using those tools to understand cities. I'm just using this to illustrate the point I made at the beginning, which is that humans self-organize into cities, but what he demonstrated by going through and tracking all of the flows at every level, meaning everything from food and gasoline and materials for building and people, that the center of cities represent hugely intense sites of resource exchange. Again, not a mystery, but this allows us to really see the structure of contemporary cities. And in an island nation like Taiwan, Taipei is the center of virtually everything. That's why I say when we're here in State College, we are, yes, we're in the country, but we are also a very real part of, not, of course, Taiwan, but a very real part of an economy that is centered on some major cities, the megalopolis. We've taken a bit of this work. This was a project by a couple of students about 5 years ago. And I can say this was partly inspired by a visit when this is, back up. This is a county in western New York, the westernmost county in New York, Chautauqua, New York. It's a very rural county. Two students prepared a complete environmental analysis of this to ask exactly about this question. How was this county organized? How did the cities relate to the other parts and so forth? In order to do the research for this, we took the group of students on a 1,500-mile we called it the Rust Belt tour. Discovered that the Rust Belt is no longer so rusty. There's stuff happening everywhere. One of the stops was David Orr's net zero building at Oberlin. And he very casually said to the students, oh yeah, we're doing this Oberlin project, and it's really, you just draw a boundary around the city and you track everything that goes in and out. The students go, oh great, we should do that. Turns out that's incredibly difficult. Data is never tracked at the level that you would like. But they did a remarkable job, and I'm using this point to show that even here in what we would think of as it is the most rural county in New York State, what you'll see is the pattern that Shuli Huang talked about, and then I've shown, which is that most of the resource flows of the county are concentrated in the very small amounts of developed land. The less intensive the resource flows are, the bigger the piece of land. So there's a hierarchy that has emerged there in land use. I won't explain it in any detail, but basically these are the engines of the economies that territorialize the land around them. So now to dip into the third and final principle, those two studies I was showing were all looking at resource flows. They were looking at the things that we mostly pay attention to because they're kind of easy to pay attention to. And I'll be honest, when we're looking at carbon footprinting, this is almost all that's being looked at, and I think one has to go a step further. What I mean by that is it's easy to keep track of, or economists have been keeping track of, how much fuel oil and natural gas and food crosses different boundaries, and all the stuff that's bought and used in a year is kept track of pretty well, or you can find ways to keep track of it. But what do we do with that stuff? We build all kinds of structures that allow us to do more of that, to intensify the use of it. So I'm showing you a picture of my current city, Philadelphia, and obviously the concentration of buildings, the concentration of people, the concentrations of systems that allow you to support more people and more buildings, right? That it functions like a giant vacuum, bringing in all of these resources. So the third piece we need to pay attention to, and there is real work to be done, is to understand this process of what I'm calling city building. And so Odom's third principle, which he only sort of came to at the end of his life, and his unit at Florida, University of Florida, was right next to, there's a school of construction, and he got drawn into some discussions there, and realized that yes, there were these energy flow hierarchies, and they taught us about ecosystems, they could teach us about cities, but that no energy never travels by itself. It's always in some material form, either lots of material or even very little bits of material, but it always is both being carried along in some in material form, and it's also being used to reorganize material. So his third principle, I'll say my third principle, is that materials end up concentrated in hierarchies that correspond very closely to those energy exchange hierarchies, and they both reinforce them, help make them, intensify them, and they also limit future possibilities. So once you've built a city, your future city has to be built starting with that city. And honestly, that's the problem that we as designers least like to talk about, right? All that stuff that some other inventive person did, I want to do this brand new thing, but this honestly is possibly the most challenging topic. If we're talking about changing the carbon footprint of Philadelphia, new buildings are easy. New buildings are a piece of cake. It's dealing with this existing infrastructure, existing buildings and so forth that becomes the real challenge. So I just finished by saying, so we've started a project looking at the regional flows of resources in Philadelphia, partly to test what Shili Huang had said, and also just to figure out what it takes to gather all this data. It does pretty much agree with the theory that he was advancing. And honestly, you think, of course, right, resources are concentrated in cities. We weren't entirely sure because, right, Philadelphia is very much a part of this megalopolis. There are tens of thousands of people in Philadelphia who work in New York and work in Washington. So we weren't sure whether this thing had fallen apart, these old city centers. But in fact, it is still very centralized. This region is actually an administrative unit for transportation. And what you realize is that Philadelphia, which started as just one of a number of colonial cities, has actually swallowed in one sense or another a whole bunch of other cities. This region, this economic and functional region, actually includes the capital of New Jersey, right? In Trenton, New Jersey. It includes a whole bunch of other former towns. But what we've realized is that this was just tracking all these resource flows, right? The thing that's sort of easy to do. What we've started doing is actually going through and trying to quantify and understand all the assets that those resources have been used to build up. We're doing this still at a kind of census tract level. Again, devilishly hard sometimes to do this stuff, so I have some amazing students figuring out how many buildings of what type are in different regions. We've also started quantifying, following some of the work of Odom's colleagues and former students and so forth, recognizing that things like education. Education is an asset that we build up. It dissipates, right? Once you die, your education is gone. But it is a very real asset, and so are other infrastructures. So what we see here, Center City, Philadelphia, which 50 and 100 years ago was unquestionably the economic center of Philadelphia. This has long since dispersed, and what we see is that pattern of dispersal. This is what's called City Line or Township Line Road. There's more economic activity to the west of the city now than there is in the center city itself. More assets are being distributed around the region. So what we're looking at is a different kind of city than that easy central city. Now, this is not news to anybody who lives in the city, so it's reassuring to have this tell us something that we already know to be true. So I'm just going to finish up. Because I realized I was coming to talk to a group that was thinking at the scale of the landscape. I've given all landscape examples. I will say we spend most of our time thinking about buildings. This is sort of a summary diagram of what I would say are the lessons that we've taken from bringing ecology into design. And for us, it's been hugely helpful to do this. This is literally diagramming every conceivable form of resource flow or asset that we could name. I can now name a few that are missing for a single house, and asking how that's organized, how that works, how that can present to us new design problems. One thing it told us right off is that there are 3 very different design problems present in any building. I call them cleverly site, shelter, and setting, because if things all begin with the same letter, it seems easier for people to remember them. But making the point that Locating buildings are in a sense an intensification of a location in the city, right? You can build some kinds of things in some places and some kinds of things in others. You don't build 60-story high-rise in the middle of cornfields for lots of different reasons, but at the end of the day, it's important to understand the degree to which the site itself constrains the building because of its relationships. Second, the thing we spend most of our time as designers thinking about, what I'll call shelter, keeping buildings cool or warm or lighted. That's actually what we spend most of our time doing, and in fact, the program, thank you for mentioning the program, which is a post-professional program, so anybody here who's getting a 5-year degree in architecture can come to our program. We spend most of our time teaching young architects how to make buildings that heat, cool, and light themselves, right? That are adapted to their climate and need almost no external resources. But as we've worked on it, we've discovered that's actually a pretty easy problem. The other problem, the one that most of us live most of the time, is all the stuff that people do in buildings. Yes, some of that is affected by the way the building is configured and can be altered, but much of it is, right, all the stuff we plug in, all the forms of work, all the forms of activity. And this, for me, has actually become a really interesting design problem because it is exactly like any of these other ecological problems. It's one that requires lots of different kinds of expertise, and so we have to think critically about how to do it. And when we look at resource flows, most of the resources in buildings go to the stuff that people do inside, not to maintaining the building anymore. Most of it, in fact, the category in surveys called other has been the fastest growing category in buildings, and that's because we're all plugging all this stuff in and finding cool new things to plug in. Okay, so I'm going to finish just to say 3 principles, not that tell us exactly what to design, but that give us the context for the design and keep us from being naive, I hope, about what we're trying to accomplish. Thank you.